talk about some of the movements that occur at the shoulder. So I want you to do something simple. You're going to take your hands, put them at your sides, but I want you to turn your palms to face backwards. And we're going to take our arms upwards, and you notice you get to a point where you kind of feel a bit of impingement. In other words, that's about as far as it goes. But if you take your arms back out, you externally rotate the arms where the palms are facing forward, you notice we can do a full 180 degrees. So my question is, why can I do the full 180 degrees when I am in external rotation, but when I'm in internal rotation, I somehow get stuck? Well, a lot of it has to do with the design of the shoulder. So out here, just a little behind the midpoint of the arm, is a little bit of a bony projection, sometimes called the greater tubercle. That's where your deltoid attaches. And then here, of course, you have the acromion process. Now, when you took your arms and you rotated them inward, you actually rotated that humeral head forward. And then as you proceeded to abduct, what happened is this big bony projection started to impinge itself into that space. It's called the subacromial space. Usually that space is pretty small, about 2/5 of an inch, about 5 to 10 millimeters. Now, everyone's a little different because some people can get a lot more movement than other people. So we all have different amounts of space. But what's actually in that space, it's important to know, is a little fluid-filled sac called a bursa. The bursa is kind of a little shock pad, or a little whoopee cushion, right? But what's lying in that segment too is two tendons, the tendon of the supraspinatus coming down and the long head of the biceps that's kind of coming down and running through the front of the arm here down. And what happens is if you were internally rotated and you kept coming up, you kept compressing that space and irritating that bursa, and that bursa starts to swell and starts to restrict circulation to those two tendons, and you start getting a little bit of that pain, discomfort that we call impingement syndrome. But when you actually took your arm and externally rotated, this bony projection fell behind the acromion process, and that's why you had no impediments in terms of taking your arm up overhead. Now, given what you just learned, think of the applications to training. Think of a particular exercise that a lot of people do in the gym that involves internal rotation and abduction of the arm, independent of what the forearm's doing. The elbow's got nothing to do with this. It's got to do simply with the humerus as it relates to the scapula. Well, think of an upright row. Most common exercise that we tend to see that causes a lot of impingement, but there's two other exercises. This same movement is also used in a clean and in a snatch, right? So we know to think about that. So what you should be doing is always screening your athletes, screening your clients, by simply doing a little test, by internally rotating, and based on how high they can get, when they reach that first point, it's not a forced movement, it's that first point where you might see a little resistance, where maybe the traps are getting a little bit activated to help continue the motion. That should be your point where you're noticing you're closing that subacromial space, and that should be your end point. In other words, that's as far as you lift. So on an upright row, that's as high as you go. On a clean, that's where you start transitioning into the catch phase.